looks like we're live, so let's go. Okay, so this is a an urgent late Friday live stream. In the news, some people have leaked a bunch of really sensitive information for a bunch of users. If you're a vibe coder, now I hate the term vibe coding, but I'm going to use it here because I know that's the probably the best way to describe what people who are non-technical doing coding with AI, what they're doing. If you're an AI coder, and you don't really know much about cybersecurity, then this stream is for you. If you're building an app, especially if you have users that are putting potentially sensitive information in your app, I'm just going to show you real quick how to secure your S3 buckets. So this will probably be a 30-minute stream. Let's jump right in. So again, this is if you are an AI coder, you are securing S3 buckets or you're using S3 buckets to store pictures, audio, anything that your users are accessing, either uploading, downloading, those sorts of things, then this stream is for you. So what I want to do real quick here, we're going to create a page example. So you probably can't see my screen very well. Let's see if I can zoom in. All right, so we're going to create a page example for a vibe coding demo where we allow users to upload images to an S3, an AWS S3 bucket. List those images and download them. All right, so we're going to get cursor going here. It is going to build out a basic demo for us. I didn't even tell it what framework or anything, and I'm doing this in a hurry. So we're going to see what it comes up with. This will be kind of fun for everybody. It's building out project context. So the idea here is that when we create an S3 bucket, an S3 bucket is essentially just a file store. It's accessible, anywhere you can get from S3. There are tons of different permissions that you can apply. A lot of them are very confusing if you haven't dealt with cybersecurity stuff before. So you might be looking at this going, I have no idea what any of these permissions, any of these things mean. So we're going to walk through that real quick just to give you a high level understanding of what an S3 bucket permissions, what you can apply to these S3 buckets so that you can make sure that yours are secure. All right, so I've got my trusty Grok on the side here, also helping me along. So when we hit create bucket, we get a bunch of different permissions. There's general purpose buckets, there's directory buckets. and as you can see here, directory buckets are recommended for low latency use cases. General purpose are recommended for most use cases. Um, and they allow a mix of storage classes. So really, if you're uploading pictures and things, you're probably looking at general purpose. We're not looking at super low latency work there. You're just uploading something. S3 buckets are pretty fast in general. So this is not something where we're dealing with high transaction rates of maybe important logs that we're trying to keep in here or things like that. So I would recommend you start off with general purpose. In this case, we're just going to go test vibe code demo is the name of our S3 bucket. Of course, there's going to be limits. It has to be between 3 and 63 characters, and only certain valid characters here. So hyphens, periods, and then alphanumerics. You can't do underscores or any other, backslash, forward slash, those sorts of special characters. You can choose settings from an existing bucket. Let's leave that off for now, and we'll walk through what we're looking at here. In terms of object ownership, so this is control ownership of objects written to this bucket from other AWS accounts. So this is where we apply access control lists. That's what ACL stands for. An access control list is going to help secure our bucket. So they grant basic read-write permissions. This format is a little bit like of a legacy approach. AWS recommends, you see it says recommended there, recommends disabling access control lists via S3 object ownership. And so that'll set to bucket owner enforced, making the bucket owner own all of the objects and manage access solely through other policies. And we're going to see those other policies here in a moment. Now, here's the big one, block public access settings for this bucket. Now, you would think, public access, that means public internet, right? That means that no one's going to be able to access the content in my S3 bucket if I block public access. And this is the key, where we really want to, kind of dive in, because this is most likely the issue that was happening. I don't actually know what happened to the T app, but we're going to presume that it was. You can create an S3 bucket. S3 buckets are amazing. They're very versatile. You can create a static website, upload it into an S3 bucket, and say, hey, host this, so anyone can access all of the assets within that bucket, and it actually becomes a web host, but it's a static web host, right? We compile our CSS, our HTML, our JavaScript files into essentially a folder. We upload that folder into an S3 bucket, and it's an incredibly low latency, highly available area website. And that's all we need, right? So that's why we would set a bucket to be completely open. That's one of the very few use cases that we want to actually set the bucket completely open. So let's walk through the options here and see what we want. So block all public access turns everything off. Um, we've got, we can reject, so block public access to buckets and objects granted through new access control lists. This means that S3 is going to block public access permissions applied to newly added buckets or objects and prevent the creation of new public access lists for existing buckets and objects. So that means that it doesn't change any existing permissions that allow public access to S3 resources using ACLs. Okay, so this is a confusing one. We're going to dive into these here in just a little bit further. Um, Let me get a little bit more detail up here so I can walk through these. We've got block public access to buckets and objects granted through any access control lists. So that means Uh, so if an access control list grants public access to buckets and objects, we're blocking that. We're blocking public access to buckets and objects granted through new public bucket or access control points, right? Like this is really confusing. So there's a lot of settings in here. S3 will ignore public and cross-account access for buckets. If you're confused, I think most people are. I'm pulling up a little bit more detail right now as we figure that out. And while we do that, I'm just going to go over to our app and take a look at where we're at. So it looks like we're ready to run an npm install. It's going to be a Node app. I don't know what flavor. Looks like maybe Next, a Next app. And then we're going to run dev. Now, the key here is that all Cursor is telling us is to set up AWS, create an S3 bucket, create an IAM user with S3 permissions, which I'll explain here in a moment because we're almost there in the settings. And then in our environment file, add the AWS credentials. Okay, so here in backend, we've got this environment.example. Environment variables are variables that are available, but not in our code, but they're available to our backend server while the server is running. So this is a good way to have secrets accessible to your server, but not in your code. You don't want to store secrets in your code. So secrets go in the environment file. I'm going to copy this file. I'm going to paste this and rename it. It's just going to be .env. That's how Next or Node is going to recognize that as a bunch of environment settings that we need to apply. And then we need to go retrieve all of these things. Now, this is the easy part, right? Access ID, access key, secret access, AWS region, S3 bucket. It's the settings in the buckets themselves that Cursor is not going to be is not going to be like, hey, it looks like you've left this open. This is where you can fall into trouble, right? All right, so let's walk through. Now that we see this running, let me actually get it running up here. npm run dev. Looks like we got an issue. Let's see what's wrong. I'm just going to keep this going so that we get our example up and running. Again, I'm doing this on the fly, so you have to bear with me a little bit. But we're going to get that website running. In the meantime, we're going to walk through creating this S3 bucket a little bit further. All right, so the first option says block public access to buckets and objects granted through new access control lists. This setting acts as a safeguard to prevent the accidental or intentional introduction of new public access permissions via ACLs. So when it's enabled, which it is here in our example, Amazon S3 actively rejects any API operations that attempt to apply a public ACL to a bucket or objects. So it would say, hey, we've got a new access control list that's now going to apply a public access grant onto this bucket. So you imagine you have grant and deny sets of lists of rules that are being applied. This is where AWS gets super confusing and it's hard to follow and kind of triage, like when or you don't have access. Typically, you're trying to figure out why. So when a new access control list pops up, what we're going to do is say, nope, we're going to block that access control list from providing permissions on this bucket. So whatever permissions that we set from the beginning here, are going to stay, and then we'll worry about setting the permissions if we need to open things up a little bit later. All right, so S3 is actively rejecting any API operations that attempt to apply a public ACL to this bucket. All right, so so that's the first option. So we definitely want to leave that one enabled, because then we are disabling public access through new ACLs. We're going to block public access to buckets and objects granted through any access control list. So this ignores public access permissions that are granted via any ACL. So this one's taking a broader approach by causing S3 to completely disregard any public permissions granted via ACLs, whether new or existing. When enabled, any public access attempts based on ACLs are denied, even if the ACL explicitly allows it. So if the ACL says allow users or allow authenticated users, this thing's going to say nope, no public access via any ACL. Unlike the previous setting, it doesn't prevent the creation of public ACL operations, any ACLs. Operations like put object with a public ACL will succeed, but the public grant won't be honored in practice. All right, so that's a little bit confusing. This is particularly useful for locking down ACL-based public access without the hassle of manually revoking or deleting existing ACLs, which could be numerous in large buckets. So for example, if an object has a legacy ACL granting public read access, enabling this setting will immediately block unauthorized users from accessing it via that ACL, while still allowing the ACL to exist for potential future use or auditing. So this is just blocking it. It's not blocking the creation of the ACL, if that makes sense. So the ACL can say whatever it wants. This option is kind of like a nuclear option that says, nope, you cannot actually have that access. Block public access to buckets. And really the reason that these ACLs have come out and how we get into this trouble is that over time, configuration gets really complex with these big cloud systems, right? And so if you're at a company that's doing $100 million a year in business, you're running some expensive SaaS, you've probably got 50 or more ACLs with all these different buckets. You've got a ton of configuration that you're managing. If someone screws up one of those ACLs and says grant, public read to all buckets, this is a way to kind of like say no, that's not going to happen for this bucket. So it's a last layer of defense, because in cybersecurity we want layers of defense, right? We want multiple permissions that have to be checked along the way before we grant access to something. That's the idea. All right, so the third option says block public access to buckets and objects granted through new public bucket or access point policies. So this setting focuses on policies rather than ACLs. So we've got policies and ACLs. So keep those two concepts here. When enabled, it prevents the attachment or update of any new bucket policies or access point policies that would grant public access to the bucket or its objects. Specifically, operations like put bucket policy or access policy. What it does is act as a gatekeeper for policy changes, ensuring that no new policies introduce public vulnerabilities. All right, so that's the third option. And finally, the fourth option says, and we're going to walk through policies versus ACLs here in a moment, as well as IAM, Identity Access Management in AWS. Okay, so then the fourth one is block public and cross-account access to buckets and objects through any public bucket or access point policies. So this is the most comprehensive policy-focused setting. When enabled, S3 ignores any public or cross-account access granted through bucket or access point policies, effectively limiting access to only the bucket's owner's AWS account and authorized AWS services. So this is another nuclear option that says we're not going to have we're going to lock everything down essentially to only like authorized services to access this bucket. This applies to both existing and new policies. Public grants are not honored even if the policy explicitly allows them. And then you can see here at the top, if we block all public access, then it by default forces all four of these options on. Okay, so let's set that there for a moment. We're going to go through some other settings and we'll decide exactly how we want to set this, and then we're going to use our demo app to actually see this in action, and then we'll test to make sure that we can't that no one can access our S3 bucket without our permission. All right, so bucket versioning. Versioning is great if you've got specific assets that are going to be updated over time. So it keeps multiple variants of an object in the same bucket. It's exactly what you think it is. So you can use versioning to preserve, retrieve, and restore every version of every object stored in your Amazon S3 bucket. So typically pictures would not fall into this category because we're not updating pictures. That would be more of just like a recycle bin recovery kind of activity as opposed to versioning. Versioning would be more like documents. If we have documents that are going to be updated, someone's going to save and upload and overwrite an existing version of the document, then we might want to keep new versions or old versions around just in case we want to see what happened and do some triage there. Tags are optional. This is just a way for you to identify and group different assets within your AWS account. So that's when you would use tags. So you can apply a tag here. Here we'll say, there's a key and value pair is usually how we do tags. So we'll say maybe our key is purpose, and we're going to call this vibe coding demo. That would allow me to go find and remove all of the assets that I build for this specific stream. Default encryption. Encryption, so server-side encryption with Amazon managed S3 keys. Server-side encryption with AWS key management service keys. That's how we can maybe have a different service that manages our keys for us. Otherwise, Amazon will do it automatically with S3 managed keys. And then there's dual layer server-side encryption with AWS key management service keys. What I'm going to do is just see this. My assumption is that that the key management service allow me to bring my own key. I'm going to check on that real quick. What bringing your own key would do would actually be allowing you to encrypt assets to the point where, because most of these keys that we would use would be what's the term? Not asynchronous, but they would be. Sorry, I gotta find the term because I need to make sure to use the right term. This is in cybersecurity. Sorry, one sec. I gotta pull this up. So we're looking for the term for keys that are asymmetric keys. That's what I'm looking for. So asymmetric keys have a public and a private key. The public key can be posted publicly. It's how you encrypt things. So you use the public key to encrypt an object. The private key is used to decrypt something. Only the person or the server or the system with a private key can actually decrypt things that have been encrypted with the public key. So you say, here's an image, for example. Here's a picture of my driver's license. I upload that and it gets encrypted using the public key. Even if somebody else were to download that, it should not be readable because it's encrypted with the public key. Oh, it's encrypted with the public key, but it can only be decrypted with the private key. And ideally, if you have security of a high enough level, then we theorize no one could break that key within any reasonable amount of time. You need a lot of compute power. That's why quantum computing is going to screw all this up, but we'll get there later. So anyway, when we're asking about encryption levels here, we're trying to figure out, okay, how do we want to encrypt this information? So in the case of Amazon's AWS Key Management Service, this allows you to bring your own key by importing your own cryptographic key material into a customer managed key management service. So I could bring my own key. Amazon would then only have the public key, the encryption key, not the decryption key, right? So then Amazon wouldn't actually be able to read any of the content. I would use, maybe in my server, I would have a decryption key. And so then the server would retrieve the document, decrypt it, and share it with the user. Amazon would not be able to look in that S3 bucket and actually see what was in there. So just keep that in mind. There's a lot of different settings here. We could, I'm not going to set that right now, but ideally what would happen, especially if you've got a bunch of, let's say, driver's license photos, is that you're using this dual layer option, which is where I'm going to have the key management service. I'm going to bring my own key, or Amazon can manage the key. That's fine, because Amazon's servers secure that key as well, right? The private key. So I'm not too concerned if Amazon servers are encrypting, or have encrypted versions of that key. What I am concerned about is that anybody who looks into the S3 bucket can retrieve and read those files. That's when we have issues, right? So we want to, ideally, for very sensitive information, you'd have dual layer, which means you'd have it server-side encryption, and you'd have your own key on top of that, especially for something like driver's license photos. All right, so in this case, though, we're going to say server-side encryption with Amazon S3 managed keys. Using an S3 bucket key for key management service reduces encryption costs by lowering calls. So do we want to have it be a bucket specific key that the S3 bucket manages? Yes, that's fine. All right, let's take a look into advanced settings. So object lock, store objects using a write once, read many model to help you prevent objects from being deleted or overwritten. You could enable that. And this basically says permanently allows objects in the bucket to be locked. That means that once they've been uploaded in there, they can't be deleted or overwritten. So that's something. Object lock would just be another way to store the data. That's not necessarily a way to secure it. Okay? We don't need to have that for our example here. Okay, so what we've got now is we're blocking all public access. We have Amazon managed keys. Let's create the bucket. Here it is. All right, nice and snappy, much faster than Azure, by the way, I have to say. All right, and so one way to test this is going to be interesting. So we're going to upload a file. I'm going to add a file from my local downloads folder. It's just going to be an image, okay? Now, right now, I can access that image because I'm authenticated and I'm actually viewing, the content of this S3 bucket. But can anyone else access that information? That would be the question, right? So I'm going to have Cursor do one more thing for us. We're going to write a Python script to access and download files from a specified S3 bucket. Go straight to agent for that mode, and we'll just get a script here that we'll use to test the security of our bucket. All right, so there's our picture. It's an image that I generated before the stream. It's now in my bucket. All right. Now you see here, I've got things like copy S3 URI, copy URL. I can't do that. Let's see, here we go. So if let's copy URL and paste it here, and let's look at this URL. I'm going to do it here in a new picture.markdown, in a new markdown file, just so we can see it. So it's https://test vibe code demo s3 US East 1 Amazon AWS, and then the picture.jpg. So that link, if we go there, it would theoretically tell us here's the image, right? So if I didn't have any permissions, if I had not here, let's look at permissions real quick. We're going to unblock all public access. All right? Now, if I come to this, let's see. Might take a second to load, or I've got more permissions that are being applied to it. Okay. So we've got public access turned off. We have ACLs off. Cross origin request. Let's edit our bucket policy. And we're going to write a policy here to allow all access. Okay. So we're going to write a bucket policy for public access. I'm having that generate right now. And we're going to look at, while that's happening, we're going to look at our S3 downloader.py file. It looks like we'll trigger this file here. The question is, it undoubtedly needs an S3 bucket name. Where is that located? I'm looking. What's this going to say? It's going to say need an S3 bucket. Unable to locate credentials. Okay. That's not necessarily what I'm looking for. All right, well, let's just stay focused here. So what I'm trying to do is show you an example of how it fails, but let's focus on securing it instead. So I'm going to go back to our permissions and blocking public access. We're going to block all public access. Okay, so now we need to create the right credentials. So you notice that all we've done so far is create the bucket and we've locked it down so that there's no public access. Not really exciting quite yet, right? So what we need to do is we need to give access to our application, which I think is running here. I don't need that. Yeah, it looks like it's on localhost 3000. So let's take a look. Yep, there it is. There we go. Okay. So here's our S3 Image Manager application. What we're going to do, we want to be able to choose files, upload them here, have them show up in the S3 bucket, read the files, pull them down, but we want to do so in a secure way. So we need to create what's called an IAM user and access keys. So an IAM is Identity Access Management. This is in the IAM section of AWS. So we're going to go IAM. We're going to create a user. So our username is going to be VibeCoder1. This user does not need access to the AWS Management Console, so do not select that. This is going to be a programmatic or like an API-based user, so we don't need to give it any permission to anything except for the exact thing that we're going to do right now. What we want to do is add the user. Let's see, we want to add the user to a group, but let's make sure. Yeah, so we can either add the user to a group or attach policies directly. When you add the user to a group, you then have to manage the policies that are applied to that group. So you say, all right, these 5 users go in this group, and this group has XYZ policies. We don't really need that for this demo, but however you want to manage it, you'll see that this can grow in complexity to the point where when you're making configuration changes, you get really lost. So be careful. I'm going to attach policies directly here. And what we want is full Amazon S3. So I'm going to type Amazon S3 full access. Now you can see here there's other options. There's S3 read-only access. That would be kind of the lowest. Or we've got S3 full access. In this case, we want to both upload and download files. So that's both read and write. So that's where we want full access. Okay. All right, so we're just going to check the box for Amazon S3 under attach policies directly and hit next. Again, I'm going to add our purpose tag, which is vibe coding demo. And I'm going to create this user. Okay, so now vibecoder1 exists. We now have an ARN. I think that's Amazon resource number, but it's not really a number. And we still need credentials. Okay, so we're going to go here within the IAM tab on the user. We're going to go to security credentials. And we're going to create an access key. So it looks like it's the third option down on the right, which is create access key. You see there's a lot of different options here. Leave them all blank. We don't need to create any more permissions than is necessary. In cybersecurity, we call this least privilege. So you want to keep your privileges as low as possible so that you don't have an accidental use of something. Let's say that this credential gets out and it's running around and somebody grabs it and they try to do something that you didn't intend with it. There should not be policies or permissions that allow that. And so that's why we want to keep this as minimal as possible. So this is our S3 only access user. All right, so there's different use cases. We either want to, use this for AWS command line interface to access the AWS account. We'll use it for local code. Application running on an AWS compute service or a third-party service. So depending on where you're going to host your application, that the answer to that's going to matter. Or application running outside AWS. So 3 different options there. So choose what you want. I'm going to say local code, and I understand the above recommendations. All right. Description tag, I don't need that. Create access key. All right, so now I have an access key. I'm going to go back into my environment file, and I am going to put this. So we've got access key and our secret access key. All right, so we've got secret access key and our secret. This is, I believe, in US East 1. What does it want me to do? Show. Yep, I already got that. We could download CSV that has this content. It doesn't matter. That won't be a big deal for us here. You do want to make sure that you're in the right AWS region, though. So this is US East 1. I currently in global. Let me see, where did I create this? Yeah, we'll leave it as US East 1. I think that's what I saw when I was creating potentially the user, but we can always play with that later. It will tell us in the error logs like, hey, you're using the wrong, this user doesn't exist in this region. All right, so we'll leave that there. And then the S3 bucket name. So we're going to go back to S3. It is test vibe code demo. And we're going to save that. All right, so now our environment file is up to date with the latest permissions. So that looks good. All right, so let's recap here because I know things have been jumping around. We now have an S3 management demo, an application that's going to allow us to upload and download files and list files from that S3 bucket. We have one image in there, so we do want to see that when we get everything to load properly. And we have an IAM, Identity Access Management user with a secret credential. And let's look at it again. IAM. users. There it is, vibe coder 1. And with permissions policies that allow access to the Amazon S3 bucket. Okay. The only question is we haven't attached any entities. So sometimes we'll set a policy boundary. So if you have a lot of S3, a lot of S3 buckets, let's say, you want this user to um, only have access to specific S3 buckets, then we would say, it. I'm looking for, no, hold on 1 sec. Boundary attached, policy versions. Here, it's within the policy itself. So let's go back to the policy. So you see when we look at the JSON version of this policy, and this is the generic one, it's saying action is S3 star, meaning all S3 buckets that are available. Now we can come in here when we set this policy on our user. Let me go back into permissions. We can when we create this, set that to say only the S3 bucket that that we're using, which would have a specific, like here, let me give you an example. Let's add a new permission. We'll create an inline permission and we'll do it in JSON. So here's an example where we're limiting both the actions and the resources that this IAM user can access. So in this case, we can list and get only. Here in the little statement editor, we can actually find other actions that we want to limit. So this is a really good thing to focus on here, because what I'm trying to show you is that, you know, just giving it full AWS S3 bucket full access, you get all the permissions. In this case, we can actually specify the specific permissions that we want this user to have. And you just saw it, you know, here's a bunch. List access points, list all my buckets, list jobs, list bucket versions, all these things that we don't necessarily need our app to have access to. So we want to really limit that to just read and write. And what makes the most sense when you're doing this kind of coding is start with the principle of least privilege. Only start with list, get object, and then let's go to the reader write section. We only want to create. I don't even necessarily want to give this IAM user the ability to delete objects, right? So put object would be the one I'm looking for. There it is. So get, put, and list. That's it. And then the resources, we're going to just apply our bucket name here, which is, I just have it right here. Let's just copy and paste it. Test vibe code demo. Oops. All right. And then I'm going to get rid of the two example ones. All right. So now this is the policy that we actually want to apply, because this is a limited list. So we're going to call it S3 get put list. And it doesn't like my spaces, so we'll call it like that with dashes in between. Okay, now we can actually remove the Amazon S3 full access, because that's a dangerous policy as well. So now we've created our IAM user. We've limited our permissions to get, put, and list S3 buckets within the specific resource, the S3 resource that we've created. And we've created security credentials. So now those security credentials can only do those three things in our bucket. So you can see how we went from really, really big picture, this thing can do everything, you know, maybe even public access, all of that stuff, to nope, it can actually only do these three actions within this specific resource. So you need to pay attention to stuff like this, because obviously if you're dealing with sensitive data, it's really going to matter. All right, so now we're done with our IAM piece. Let's go back to our bucket. I believe we still need to set a policy on our bucket that does allow some form of access, right? So we we need to allow some permissions on this bucket that are going to allow, some kind of action, right? So let's jump in and take a look. I had a script ready for this as well. Let's take a look at what is our permission policy or bucket policy. Now the question is how you're going to architect this app. In this case, I'm going to have there's 3 parts to it. Let me bring up Lucid and we'll just walk through it. This matters when you're building an app, so I'm going to kind of talk through like the logic that I would use here. You can either have, let's just do a new, I don't know, flowchart. Sure. It's going to say you need to start a trial. Here, we'll just do a blank diagram and we will create a new page. All right. So we have, in any code, we've got our back end, our front end, we've got the user. Now, typically I would use like, let's say here, a pill shape for the user, just because they're not the same thing. And we've got the S3 bucket. So here we'll use a hard disk. That's usually used for databases, but that's fine for this case. We'll just call it S3. So we have to figure out who's going to access what and how are they going to access it. Now you can code it, and I'm sure we could tell Cursor to do this. It would say, hey, that's a bad idea. But you could code it to say, let the user, the front end of our application, directly access the S3 bucket. It's a bad idea. I don't recommend it, but you could say that. Let's not say that. So that's a bad idea. So don't do that. What we really want is the backend to be a relay. Now, there's a couple different ways that a backend can be a relay in this instance. There. Okay. So what's going to happen is we're going to from the front end, the user's going to call the front end and say, "Hey front end, list all the pictures." The front end's going to go to the back end and say, "Okay, give me a list of all the pictures." The back end's going to reach out to S3 using our secure environment variables that we've just posted, so our user that we created, and it's going to say, "Here's my user credential. I am requesting information from this specific bucket." Amazon then looks at both the bucket policy and the IAM credential permissions and says, you're not only approved to access this S3 bucket, but the bucket will also allow you to have this information. And then the information will then be relayed and the images will be relayed. Now, there's a couple different ways we can render those images. We'll get into that in a minute, but for now, just know that this is the flow of communication. The key being, and this is the part that I want you to kind of take away here, this backend piece, just to back, come on, reorder. What did they do to this? Layer? No. Arrange, here we go, send it back. Okay, so this piece here that I've outlined with that box is the secure backend. The front end has an authenticated user and talks to the backend via that authenticated user's JWT or some sort of authentication mechanism. The front end is the browser and the user. They kind of merge together in terms of, from a backend perspective, it's just the user using the front end to request things to the backend. There should not be anything secret stored or presented within the front end itself, within your front end code. All of that must be in the back end, and the connection between those must be secure, authenticated connection. Then the back end has its own secrets that it's keeping. It's not telling the front end about, and says, I know how to access the S3 bucket. Don't worry. You just tell me what you need and I'll provide it to you. Now, when it comes to something like if we created an app where users upload their own images, then we need to also create a database that manages which pictures can I see versus which pictures can someone else see. All right, but let's not worry about that for now. Let's just worry about this specific connection. So the backend keeps those secrets, talks to the S3 bucket, and then relays information to the front end. In some cases, the backend may relay a specific a specific URL that says, here's the image location. The front end then actually accesses that information direct to that, but it's with a very narrowly scoped permission, narrowly scoped URL. Now, we'll talk about how we're going to get into this here in just a second, and we'll have Cursor explain to us how it's doing it in a secure way in just a moment. Let's make sure that we have our S3 policies set up properly for for this. And actually, let me just improve my diagram just a little bit more. I'm going to zoom in here just so you can kind of see what's happening. We've got our S3 bucket. This has both an IAM user credential. That is like an external wrapper, right? So that's saying, hey, there we go. And send backward a little more. Okay. So that's wrapping the S3 bucket. The S3 bucket has its own policies. So there's, again, layers of security here. And this guy here, the backend, requires an authenticated user in our application. A front end code and the user, that's like a free-for-all, okay? Uh, because the front end code is publicly available, anybody can review it, so you can't have any secrets in there. It's the front end's communication with the back end that must be authenticated. Anything that happens within the back end then is secure. All right, so let's look at our policy now. Going back to our bucket policy, let's take a look at our bucket policy for how we are going to allow access. How we're going to allow access here. So we want to add a new statement, and we're essentially going to say access from the public internet is fine, but only for authenticated users, and we might even scope it so that it's only for our IAM user that we created, right? So we could say IAM. No, this isn't the bucket policy I'm looking for. Hold on one second. One's being created for us while I talk here, and then we'll go from there. What it should be is probably S3. Actually, here S3. We could try their policy generator, see what it comes up with. And I'm trying to do here is parse exactly what we're allowing in this policy generator. So we want to say, hey, S3, you can have certain things that are available, right? We could even, okay, so we can even limit by source IP. I don't think we want to go that far though. List bucket, get object. So that's how we would, so we would say, okay, there's an IP address that we're going to allow access to. It's usually not ideal. I mean, if you're hosting within AWS, then you could say, okay, certain AWS services can access this bucket. That's probably the easiest and most secure way to do it. Another option, what would be another option? Another option would be, let's see. No, I don't like what I'm getting told here. So hold on one second. Let me just pull this up a little bit. I'm asking it, how do I make sure my S3 bucket policy allows public access, but only for my authenticated IAM user? That's the key, right? Is that the IAM user gives the permissions to those credentials, but when and how those credentials are used is one thing that we need to ask about. In this case, it could be public because let's say we're going to host on Vercel or somewhere else. So, okay, it has to be publicly available because we don't know all their IP addresses at Vercel. Um, so then the next question is going to be, well, how do we make sure from the IAM user that we created we keep? The S3 bucket then has to have its own permissions to make sure that um, that we're providing the right level of access. All right, so we need to create a bucket policy that explicitly grants permissions to that IAM user's ARN while implicitly or explicitly denying access to others. Public access in the AWS S3 typically means allowing unauthenticated, anonymous access to anyone on the internet via a policy of principal star, which contradicts restricting to only your IAM user. If you truly want anonymous public access that can't be limited, this setup makes the bucket private and accessible solely via authenticated. Okay, so we don't want that, right? We don't want truly anonymous access. All right, so now let's take a look. This is the policy that was generated, and we're going to walk through it. So we're going to allow a specific IAM user. Now, here's the user identity information. So let's go IAM. I'm going to open up a new tab here, and we're going to grab that IAM's ARN right here, and we're going to replace that in our example. So paste that in. So there's the actual ARN that was provided. So this is saying allow specific IAM user. So you see the effect allow S3 on the resource. Now the resource is our S3 bucket that we've already named here, test vibe code demo. Okay, there's one, there's two. Deny all others. So you see it's effect deny, principal star, action, all actions are being denied here via this to this bucket. And that's where, so the deny happens where, you see this condition, string not equals principal ARN. So let's go back and grab our principal ARN. So we've explicitly allowed access, make this a little bit bigger. We've explicitly allowed access to our one IAM user, and we're explicitly denying all others. All right, and then we don't need the rest of this. Okay. And there we are. Now, when we save changes, this bucket policy still doesn't work, right? Because we need the get account public access block to view the block public access configuration. Okay, so let's just refresh the page. Now that our bucket policy is in, oh, I see. And what they're saying is, hey, you've actually blocked yourself out. So we've prevented ourself from even accessing certain things here. So what we're going to do is add our own principal in this name in here. Let's actually just copy the whole block. Paste it here and then go like this. There's probably a way to make a list, but for now I just want to show you what we're doing and how yes, it is difficult, but yes, you have to pay attention to these things. Otherwise, the whole thing goes sideways and you're going to be on the news in a bad way. Okay, now let's refresh and see if we can fix that issue. API response, not authorized to perform get bucket public access block. Oh, because I also have an explicit deny right here. And again, there's a way to do this where you have lists. I don't want to deal with that right now, so I'm just going to fix this. What I would do though, if I were to make this, kind of my permanent moving forward, is actually ask Grok, clean this up, please. All right, let's refresh the page and see if we can get our permissions back. Now that's from S3. An explicit deny. Oh, because the deny is actually, we probably need a, what do we need in there? Here, let's go edit and see if we can add in here. Do we have the ability to go a new statement? No. I want to add an or in our condition statement. No, it's not like that. Hold on, I'm going to fix that real quick. Yeah, and it's exactly what I thought it would be, which is actually here I'll do it here. So it's list, right? So we want to have a list of users that we're allowing. So it's a comma separated list like that. And we're going to copy that list because we're going to use it down below as well. Okay. All right. If yeah, something went wrong here. Some copy and paste action just went terribly, terribly wrong. Let me clean this up real quick. Okay. So we've got now what we should see is, oh yeah, there it is. Okay. Deny. There it is. Okay. Yep. There was a tragic copy and paste error that like duplicated everything. Here we go. Okay. So now let's review. We've got an allow on both of our items, right? So both my personal and this what you call it, the vibe coder one IAM user. This is why people use groups, by the way. You could just put both of us in a group, give permissions to that group, make life easier. Then we're going to do a deny all others, and it's going to be again on a list, just like this. And that list is the list of user IDs. Now when I save changes, there we go. Now we can see and edit our public block, our block public access settings. Okay, so hopefully that made sense. Again, allow and deny, allowing both users to access the test vibe code demo resource and all S3 actions, denying all others, where the string is not equal to anything in this list. Okay, so that's how we get here. Now, we're not worrying about access control list, so I'm not going to worry about that error, though we probably just need to refresh the page, would be my guess. Now, what we need to do, what we could do is just kind of refresh our page here. We still have an error loading images because remember, at the very beginning when we created this, we set block all public access, right? So, based on this approach, what public access settings do we need? That's the question. So we've got, let me go back to Lucid and kind of work this out, because it's confusing even for me, but hopefully this is helpful to someone who is working here. In AWS, we have an IAM user, which provides credentials to access things in AWS. I say things generically, but in this case, obviously, it's right there. So credentials, actually a little bit larger. So credentials to access things in AWS. That gives us, that allows us to communicate with AWS. Then there's the bucket policy. And the bucket policy allows those things to access the bucket. at each layer we're saying we're being very narrow about the scope. So narrow scope, for the IAM user, it was get, put, and list actions on the S3 resource. On the bucket policy, we were a little bit wider scope, which is fine, but we might want to limit it in the future where we say, only get put list for that specific ARN, and for our personal user, we get the star. That's, again, we would probably craft this and configure this over time to really be refined. In this case, though, if someone has access to the IAM user, it's going to be limited by the IAM credential, permissions or policies that we've applied to it. So get put list on the S3 resource. The reason that you can set them at different layers is because you can apply permissions to groups, and then those groups can have narrower permissions and wider permissions on different resources. It gets very confusing and very complicated, which is why this happened, right? Just to someone who was, let's say, vibe coding an app and they didn't know what permissions they needed to put. Okay? So, um, so that's kind of where we're at here. So now so those are the different layers here, of what we've applied in terms of permissions. I know it's kind of taken us a moment to get there, but that's where we need to be. We want to continue to block public access. So we're going to continue. So this is the recommendation, is public ACL, all the ACLs that would say, or policies that would say give public access. We don't want public access because that means that's not just public internet access, that's unauthenticated access to the S3 bucket. Okay, so now let's figure out what's happening with our app. So we have our app here. We're going to refresh the page, and we're getting 403s, and it says list images, invalid access key ID. The AWS key access key ID you provided does not exist in our records. So then let's look at our environment file again and see if we got that right. I know the secret access key is right, but is the access key ID right? So let's go, maybe I grabbed the wrong thing. And the question is, are we in the right region, right? So how would I know what region I'm in? Da, 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 da. All right, a little bit of debugging here. And let me make sure I've copied it properly. Make sure there's no spaces on the end, though I don't think that should matter. We might need to restart the app. So let's just terminate, and then we'll run npm run dev again. There we go. All right, and here might need to happen is I've got a two-part app, so I need to cd into the backend folder and do an npm run dev there as well. Now the way it's written, run dev starts both. Okay, so we're fine there. So we don't need to run it separately. Then where is our app? It shows for a second and then it disappears. Okay, close everything. Make sure there's not a second terminal running somewhere. All right, the API is on port 3001, but in this case we want, for some reason that page is not pulling up. Okay, let's try one more time. And we're going to do that with developer tools open so we can see what errors are thrown. It looks like invalid time range. So this is actually probably not the end of the world. It means that we're having an issue with other components running. So we're just going to throw that into cursor and see if it can fix our error for us. The question is whether it's hitting the S3 bucket or not, and if there are any permissions happening, any issues happening there. There we go. Okay. So what we're able to see now with the S3 bucket, blocked from all public access, is that we're able to see that there's a file here. So that's a good start. It's not the best in the world. We're going to refresh and I want to, ideally this whole thing works, but we can see that it can now list the files. And what's happening is that it's trying to access, so this is a good thing here. It's trying to access the pictures and directly. It's just saying, hey, here's the URL for the picture. And that picture is saying for 403 forbidden, meaning you're not allowed to do this. And the reason you're not allowed to do this is because of the policies that we've set. You can't have public access to these files. So the question is going to be, now, how do we do this, right? Like that's the key. And okay, I see. All right. Okay, so we're going to do this. Now, the question is going to be, how can we access these pictures from the client without enabling public access to the S3 bucket? These are the questions that we need to ask when we're building an app like this, because there's a way that Amazon can relay a specific token that allows us to grab those. They call it a pre-signed URL. So the pre-signed URL has a token that says this user is allowed to access this image, but that URL is only valid for that image, and it's even typically only valid for a few minutes. So it's like temporary access. You can have it 5 minutes. You can download this picture with this URL. All right. So it's updating the Amazon SDK real quick, and then we're going to use pre-signed URLs. So we're going to say use pre-signed URLs from the AWS S3 API. Okay, what's cool about Cursor is now I can just load that in the queue. So now that command is sitting there in the queue ready to fire off once this finishes. While that's happening, let's try dropping an image in. I am going to upload an image. And let's see what happens here. So we've got an image upload command running. It failed. Let's see, why did it fail? I want to see the error. Okay, module not found. Oh, it's because it's in the middle of updating the Amazon SDK. So that would take a moment. So let's wait just a moment till we get that all figured out. If you ever see when you're in Cursor and you've got a new message queued up, and if you ever see like, okay, now it's doing a README and all of that stuff, you can just hit enter again. It'll kind of force it to stop and redo what you're doing. I'm going to reload my page, and I'm going to try to upload once again. Looks like we're having other issues. probably because of we're using Vite in this app, so it's not Next, it's Vite. Um, these are optional. I don't really want to deal with that. So now that we're using the S3 SDK, we need to, we're going to have to fix our API calls so that we actually can retrieve the details of that image. So now our S3 calls are failing. So we're just going to paste this in and queue that up next. This is adding a new interface for the pre-signed URLs. So essentially, again, I'll show you the URL here once we have it, but it's going to be a URL to that specific image with a big token on the end of it is at least how it's done in Azure Blobs. And the benefit of this is we're not going to relay the content of the picture through the server. That would take a lot of server bandwidth. So we actually, what we're going to do is just create the connection, say, hey, this user wants to see this thing, and then the server is only going to send the URL to the user. The URL, the user is then going to go hit directly, if I go back to my Lucidchart, is then going to go back and hit the S3 bucket directly. And that's using a different form of authentication called the pre-signed URL. So this is the pre-signed URL. Now, in the case of sensitive info, does a user need to see that again? Are they just uploading it and it's like a workflow process and now we just store it in an S3 bucket and leave it there? That's probably the best way to handle it. You don't necessarily need to show them their own sensitive data back in the app, especially something like a driver's license. It's just for identity verification, then just leave it. So, so in this case, though, what we're going to do is a pre-signed URL will then allow us to still access everything. So let's take a look at where we're at. Refresh our page. Oh, the app crashed. Get it going again. I had S3 connections secure a second ago. Let me just stop this because sometimes it gets in the way of things. All right, so here we are. We're hitting 500 errors. And it's because we see an API request failed, syntax error, unexpected end of JSON input. So we've got something probably wrong in our API request. Let's take a look at that code real quick because sometimes having eyes on is better than just hoping that the cursor will figure it out. So I like to accept all, especially once things are starting to work. And now we can see where are we going to query this. Actually, what is this saying? This said, because I gave it the error message already, it said, unexpected input, end of JSON input suggests the server is returning an empty or malformed response. Let me check if the backend is running. Okay. Yeah, and then it went and kind of destroyed everything in the backend. I think it overwrote our environment file as well. Because it goes, oh, there's no environment file. That's what you need. So it totally botched our environment file there. Let's see if we recover. I want to restore to a specific point, revert to a specific point. Let's see, will it fix my environment file? No, it will not. So it looks like my environment file is lost. All right, so let's stop. And now we got to fix that. So this will happen. Keep your keys somewhere else other than in the actual interface. We're going to create an access key number 2 for local code. And here it is. So we've got our access key. We've got our secret access key. Oh, I don't like it when they have special characters in there. That's usually when they get messed up. And then we've got our S3 bucket called test vibe code demo. And really that's all we should need. for this demo. So without letting cursor touch any of our code again, there, S3 connection successful. That's what we wanted to see. And boom, now we're pulling, okay, I'm excited. So now we're pulling the image from the S3 bucket. Let's look at how that's being done. I'm going to refresh the page. You'll see the image right here. Oh, lucky for us, it's loading twice for some reason. That's not ideal, but we'll worry about that later. Here is the incredibly long. Where can I put this? Here, I'll put it in picture and mark down. The incredibly long signed URL to retrieve this image. And what's nice about having it in the S3 bucket, it's lightning fast, very low latency. So if I had 100 images to load right now, it's not limited by my server bandwidth. It's not relaying the actual content of the images through the server and then rendering them on the page. It's saying, hey, you can access these 100 images and go direct to the S3 bucket, but the S3 bucket does not have public access available. So the server has authorized the user now to access that information. Let's try one thing here. We're going to try to upload an image. Upload successful. If I refresh the page, I should see that now in the page. Let's see. Can I see it? I can see it here. Oh, it's a JFIF. That might be preventing us from visualizing it. I didn't specify which images we needed to support. So let's try this. And there it is. How cool is that? So now I've uploaded the image, I've retrieved the image, I've got a functioning interface, and I've done it with a completely secure approach. So this, what, has it been an hour? However long it's been, I can't find it. Hour 17. I told you 20 or 30 minutes, but I lied. So this hour would have saved the T app, right? Because the T app would have been able to, not that I even agree with the purpose of the T app, but the point is that here we have a secure approach to accessing content, blobs, binary objects, binary large objects, blobs, or images, video, pictures. We can securely access that information in an S3 bucket that does not have public access. So, as another example, let's copy the URL, paste it here. We cannot access that document or that S3 bucket without the IAM user or without the signed URL, the pre-signed URL. You're not going to get a pre-signed URL for every single image in there unless you hack the server, unless you're doing all sorts of other nefarious things. So this is the key. Pay attention to these things. These are really important considerations for your users and for your app. Thank you so much for your attention today. I will publish this in a public repo. I'll attach it as a comment to this video. So if you want to check out the repo and see how this image app works, I will keep that up. I am going to delete these credentials, so don't try to hack these credentials. They won't exist here in the next little bit. Thank you so much for your time and attention. I really appreciate it. I hope you found this informative. If you did, follow, like, subscribe, all of the usual stuff. God bless and have